Okay guys, little quick one here. I was asked to provide just some information on reconstructing, rejuvenating old floppy drives, 3.5-inch ones, this is the PC kind. So this is that. All the ones I've got at the present moment are in pretty decent condition, so I'm just going to quickly go over the tools and method that I use to get these back to life. But this is one which is actually pretty modern and in pretty good nick, so I'm just going to use this as a demonstration tool. Before that though, some tools and useful stuff that we're going to need. Paintbrush, or preferably an ESD safe brush, because we are dealing with electronics here, although I just use normal paintbrush, I haven't killed anything with it yet. You really want some something like these Kimtech wipes. These are very delicate and lint-free sort of tissues, and they're really good for cleaning stuff with isopropyl alcohol in kit like this, because they don't leave any fibres behind on the heads and such like. These are sensitive things, but at this point we can be fairly manual about how we clean the heads and stuff, and it will work well. So those are useful. As you can see, I've run out. So I'm using Costco's best white tissue roll in this instance, but actually I'm not going to do the actual cleaning job of the heads itself. So anyway, I've also got a little pot for keeping my isopropyl alcohol in. A useful thing to have is some electrical contact cleaner. This is less important, but it's always good to put some on the connectors there. A lot of the issues that you will come across with these drives are mechanical and just down to lubrication. So some plain lithium grease or some 3-in-1 oil, or both if you're feeling fruity, useful to have around for putting onto the mechanical moving parts of these. So yeah, let's proceed. First thing to do is to take the drive apart as much as you feel comfortable, basically. Now all of these drives have different construction mechanisms. Some of them have fasteners which hold the sort of clamshells together. This Panasonic is a slightly less modern one, but it used some little screws to keep that shell on, which I had to remove first. This is a cheaper construction drive, and a lot of them are really like this, and they just have sort of just retaining clips which hold the clamshell together, and you can just ease them apart with a flat bladed screwdriver or some tweezers or whatever you've got to hand. And once you've got one side off, they will come apart quite easily. Some of them, the bottom part comes off too. I think on this one that is possible. In this instance, the bottom half of the shell is screwed on. So we'll just remove those little screws. Just that way. Curious. Okay, and that should just pop off. And now we get into the interesting bit. Something useful, again, to have around when doing this is cyanoacrylate superglue for the inevitable moment when you break the plastic bits. It will happen. Certainly on the more modern drives this is less of an issue because the plastic hasn't degraded so much. But some of the old ones, you'll find some of these plastic clips that retain the front parts, they can get very brittle. So when you come to take all of the fronts off these, then make sure you're very hesitant about how you pop these clips and such like, and make sure that you do that rather than just wrenching everything off, because they will snap and they are a pain, and you will probably find yourself super gluing things back together. So that's that one side off. That's that other side off. So those are no longer retained there. And then you can actually get the plastic front off as well. I should have taken the plastic front off before I took the bottom off really, but we are where we find ourselves. So that should release nicely. And then driver's relatively fair now. This is a much more modern design than you'll find in sort of 486s and things. These are small disc motors and a small stepper motor for driving the heads as well. They're a lot more compact. There's a lot less in the volume really. But they all work roughly the same. You have two motors in these drives, one that spins the disc around and one that drives the head back and forth to change the position of the head to read the various bits of the disc. And if I insert a disc here, we can see the mechanism moving, and you can see as you push it in, this pushes the window aside, opens up the disc to the heads, and the heads pop down when the disc pops down into the holding mechanism. And then the second motor, the stepper motor for the heads, drives this lead screw, and there's a little bit which sits on that lead screw and means that the heads go back and forth when this motor turns. So the first thing that I would do with this is take it over to the air compressor, and I would just blow out all the dust. And there's usually quite a lot of dust in these if they've been sitting in a machine for 20 years. And I know some people are a little reticent to do that. They think it's going to push it into unhelpful places and stuff, but the mechanisms in these are simple enough that that's really not going to be a problem, and we're going to clean up and re-grease this anyway when it comes to it. So any dirt and stuff that gets stuck to these you can just pick off and wipe off. But try to avoid, if there's good grease on here, try to avoid spraying that around with the air compressor, I would say. Once the air compressor is done and you've got the dust out of this, probably worth going at it with the paintbrush a little bit, just get any sticky bits of dust and stuff out of it. And then once we've done that, it's time to look at the mechanical parts. Now, there are two mechanical things that we wish to particularly pay attention to here. One is the lead screw, which is the bit that drives the head back and forth. We want to make sure that that turns easily and that it is well lubricated. Now, I happen to know this one is, and I'm not going to stick my finger in there because it's all greasy and horrible. But you should be able to turn that lead screw just by moving your finger back and forth on it, and that will make the heads move back and forth a little bit. If you find that your driver's been making a lot of nasty noises and giving you errors and stuff, then usually it's a mechanical issue, and usually it's about moving the heads around. So the way to test that really is to plug the thing in to a machine that you can use to test, and try and copy a whole disk's worth of stuff and try and get it to move the heads all the way back and forth, etc. And you'll see if things are getting stuck. You'll see if the motor is not turning properly. You'll start to hear where in the drive the problem is once it's open. Quite a lot of the time it's an issue of lubrication on the lead screw or on the linear bearing shaft which runs along there. So that's like the other side of the head, and that's what it actually runs back and forth on, that keeps it moving straight. So lubrication of that shaft and that lead screw are quite often the problem that you'll encounter. If it's the motor, and it sometimes is, sometimes it's just a minor malfunction inside the stepper motor, and just a little tap with something yay big, like that much tap, can often dislodge any crustiness or alignment problems, a stuck shaft, etc., and you'll find that your motor starts working again. But the thing to do with these is, if there's any crustiness on the lead screw, then just clean it off, use isopropyl alcohol, and just get all of the grot off it, and then get some lithium grease and grease it back up. Same is true for the linear bearing shaft on the other side there. What we will do here actually is see if this moves without any, yeah, that is a very nice free moving mechanism. And now you can see that shaft in there, which is actually maybe a little dry. I might be tempted to put a little grease on that before I put this back together. Most of the time with these older ones with the bigger stepper motors on them, you won't be able to move the heads like that just by pushing them, and you shouldn't put too much pressure on because you can damage things in there. It all gets quite delicate at that point. But once you've made sure that those are lubricated and move freely, and you can make the heads move back and forth and seek by having this attached to a machine and doing disk operations, the next thing to do is to clean the heads off. Now, these are relatively accessible in these drives because they have this flat metal sort of leaf spring type affair. You can actually just lift them up and access them. Don't bend these back too far. But if you really need to bend it back further, then you can take that spring off. But you should have enough access there to use, preferably, a lint-free wipe on either on some tweezers or on a Q-tip. Dip in isopropyl alcohol and just give these a gentle rub around with the isopropyl alcohol, and then use a dry lint-free wipe and dry them off again afterward just by dabbing them, and you can do both of these heads here. The reason to do that at the end is because if we've blown stuff around, if we've lubricated things, then we've probably got crap in here anyway, and therefore the last thing to do is clean the heads, because that way they retain their cleanness when you put it back together. Okay. Now at that point, you should be able to do some testing, really. I mean, you should be able to get it to do the stuff. You should be able to put disc in. You'll notice if there's any issues with the actual loading mechanism here. You'll see, you'll feel if there's any problems with how it actually gets the discs in and stuff. And as soon as you start trying to do copies and stuff with this open and attached to the machine, you'll notice where things are skipping over. You'll notice if this shaft is turning and this isn't moving along it properly and it needs to be lubricated properly. You'll notice that it'll clicks and whirs which seem out of place. You'll notice if the heads try and go forward and then jump back, if they seem to be stuck at a certain point. One thing to note as well, that there is effectively a bearing surface here where the top head rides on the top of that mechanism. Now, that isn't actually a bearing surface while the drive is running. That is only such for when the drive is empty and the head is sitting on the top of that. But you'll notice there is a small amount of lubrication on here, just the finest amount of grease. So make sure that's there when you're done as well. At this point, most of your issues should be sorted out. If there's an electronic issue in one of these drives, and they're electronically speaking, they're relatively simple, usually it will be either something really obvious, like a blown component that you need to replace, or you won't be able to do anything about it. If the stepper motor doesn't come back to life from tapping and whatnot, unless you can find an identical drive to take it from, you're usually out of luck, because they're usually pretty specifically spec'd for these. They vary greatly, unfortunately. There's not a standard motor that goes between a lot of them. The other thing to do is to use some contact cleaner if you're getting intermittent issues of getting data off these, but the heads seem to be moving correctly and doing all that. It's worth going through all of the little connections and stuff. All these, if you've got flat flexes and stuff like that which have got connectors on them, then you can pop the connectors out and you can just pop some contact cleaner on them. Contact cleaner on the power and floppy interface pins as well. Other than that, there's not that much to go wrong with these. It's usually a mechanical problem that causes the issue. So it's just a question of getting the heads moving correctly and getting the heads clean is almost, I would say, 90% of the problems that I see. But yeah, and then you can go away and retrobrite your plastic bits. But I hope that was helpful. Questions, please.